Hello and welcome to Mann's Model Moments. Today I'm going to be talking about cataloguing my paint collection. Not once, but twice, and why you should too. I did this because as I was getting back into the hobby recently, mainly inspired by content creators like Ninjon, Miniac, Squidmar and Goobertown Hobbies, I realised they didn't really have a good grasp on what I already had. Some of my paints were very old in a whole bunch of different types of containers, so I reformatted all of my paints into dropper bottles, roughly sorted them into colour shades, and created this chart of them all with this old floor tile. This process took a long time, but it did enable me to get a good grasp of what I still had and where there were gaps to fill. The problem was that when I filled those gaps, for instance by buying the expansion set of Chimera colours, I couldn't put them where they needed to be. That's why they're in the bottom right hand corner here after everything else, unlabelled and alone. Creating the chart had also gradually added a bunch of spatters and stains to it as well, so I needed to rethink it. What I really needed was to have each paint on its own paint chit, so I could label it up and then sort it as needed. Then I could add paints in wherever I got them. Just like my first paint chart, I would have white, grey and black areas so I could judge the actual colour and coverage on different shades, and if it was a little taller I could also have single and two coat coverage, which is a lot of information to have. To this end I designed a 12 by 70mm rectangle with 1cm recessed lines in Tinkercad and printed out a whole bunch on my mighty 4K. I then glued these to magnetic sheet, separated them into individual chits, and the problem became apparent soon after. The chits were just too inconsistent. Thinking again, I had some 2mm MDF custom cut to the same dimensions from Bow and Blade Games. I'll put a link to them below, as Chris there was really helpful. But there are of course similar services provided by various companies in other countries too. The difference between these and the resin attempts was night and day, and this time I decided to cut the magnetic sheet into 1cm strips, and then these strips into 6cm sections before gluing to the bases, so there would be some room around the edge so the nice straight bases would align well on my whiteboard, and after the first one was done, I just had to repeat it a couple of hundred times to be ready. Once ready, I arranged the chits on steel sheets and primed them black, then taped off the last centimetre with Tamiya tape and sprayed them grey, before taping off the next centimetre and spraying them white. Once that was done, I had a lot of blank paint chits ready for cataloguing. To keep the paint areas consistent, I just made a little jig using one of the chits with a magnet to get the correct height, and just glued another piece of MDF to it at a point which leaves 1cm of white exposed on the chit. So just to demonstrate that, I'm going to use some golden So-Flat cadmium primrose and yellow green, and just using a cheap brush from Amazon to cover the area exposed by the jig. The main thing is try to avoid leaving visible brush strokes if possible, or to drag the paint if it started drying. Tamiya is an example of paint that tends to do that. You don't really get any carryover from the jig if you're not slopping a lot of paint about. It just needs the occasional wipe to remove any build-up or excess if you do get some. Here you can see the coverage over the three different areas. The coverage over the grey and black is about the same on the yellow, whereas the coverage on the white is much brighter, which is one of the things I really wanted to get from this, is how the paint actually looks over different tones, its opacity and that sort of information. Obviously that's important in a lot of different hobby areas, like for example choosing the paint to go over a zenithal highlighted model. Now I did these in batches of about 10, because one thing you don't want to do is get them mixed up, because the next stage after the paint has thoroughly dried is to mask off the top half of that paint and go over the bottom half again with the same colour, to give both your single and two coat coverage. I'm using 6mm Tamiya tape here, which is one of the reasons these are 12mm wide, the other being the width of the printer labels I'll show later on. Tamiya tape is really good for not lifting the prior coat, but you do need to let the paint dry properly and cure before applying it. It's also really good at being taken up and reapplied, and I used these strips of tape several times before getting rid of them. show you what that looks like, here are a couple that I've already done with the 2 coats, and you can see the difference between them. The red here is much more transparent than the pink, which tells you something about the paint and how it's going to behave on your model. It gives you information for you to make informed decisions when you're applying this to minis or models. The last practical piece is labelling, which, as I mentioned, I tended to do in batches of 10 as it makes everything manageable. This is a Nimbot printer. It's just a little Bluetooth thermal transfer label printer. They're quite cheap, and I'll put a link to this down in the video notes below as well. I'm using 12 by 40mm labels, so they completely cover the white section, as long as you're careful to get them square, so you don't need to worry about dirty smudges or anything on the white beforehand. I put the paint manufacturer and paint colour on the label, but there's enough room to put other information there if you want. Now once again, having done this for all my paints, I then needed to arrange them. And to start with, I used an app called Paint Rack to sort by colour, but I actually found the results from that rather unsatisfactory, and there were some real anomalies in there. The app developer Jeff was really good in getting back to me about this, but the bottom line is that the hex and HSV values that are used in the app come from many different sources. Some sampled from photos, some come directly from the manufacturers, etc. So the easiest way for me to overcome that was to photograph the entire collection of paint chits that I'd created under the same lighting conditions and extract HSV values from them directly. I then ordered them by this measured HSV value, and it produced much better results, and I'm much happy with the ordering I have now. All that then remained was to reorder all the paints in my paint racks and the paint chits to correspond with those, and this is the result. Although, just bear in mind the metallics and the oils aren't complete here, and I also just got a bunch more paints to add as well, so in one sense it'll never truly be finished. So after all this work, was it worth it? I'd say definitely so. Even the process of just going through your paint collection and using each paint under identical conditions gives you experience and information about that paint and the manufacturer or range it's from. That's good, but then having a lasting physical aide-memoire sitting on the wall in front of where I paint, coded to shade and laid out in the same way as my actual paints, is going to save me a lot of time and thought as I paint more. There were times during the process that it felt like a chore, but I'm so glad that I powered through this and completed it, and I'd say that the time spent with my paints will pay dividends in the future, which is why I'd say if you want to do something similar, then you absolutely should. After all, do you want the first time you use a paint to be on the mini you've already spent several hours on, only to find out it doesn't do what you want or cover like you wanted it to? That's all for this instalment of Mann's Model Moments. Please like, subscribe and share this video if you enjoyed it. It's the best way of helping me to grow the channel and produce more content like it. With that, I hope you have plenty of modelling moments of your own, and I look forward to welcoming you on the next video.